Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to this Future seminar hosted by the Copenhagen Institute for Future Studies. The seminar marks the launch of Farsight, which is our new quarterly print publication exploring possible futures with the aim of inspiring and provoking change in the present. The opening issue of Farsight is titled Entering the New Age of Work. And inside we take a look at some of the trends and forces shaping work in the decades to come, with a special focus on knowledge work and other kinds of office-bound labor. So the questions include what the role of AI and automation will be in workplaces, if the open plan office might be heading to the grave, if we will all be working in virtual worlds in decades to come, and relevant for today, if we could imagine a future without burnout. Today we'll be exploring some highlights from the publication, and I want to thank everyone for tuning in. I hope you will find the next hour or so worthwhile. My name is Casper Skovgaard Petersen. I am the head of publications here at the Institute. And to those of you who might be new to us, I should mention that we are an independent, non-profit futures think tank. We work across the spectrum of future studies and strategic foresight and have done so for the last 50 years, helping organizations and individuals to act on the future today. We've invited two guests to join us today in two live Q&A sessions. First up, we will meet Jonathan Malesic, who is an essayist, a journalist, and a former professor of theology. And Jonathan is joining us today from Dallas, Texas, to talk about The End of Burnout, which is also the title of his new book. We're going to learn from Jonathan about the causes of burnout, why it seems to be a growing and widespread phenomena, and if we could imagine a future without it. In the second session, we'll be joined by Tamira Snell, who is a futurist and advisor here at the Institute. Tamira will share her perspectives on the shifting nature and purpose of work, specifically as it relates to how new generations are changing the workplace, as well as what the long-term effects will be of some of the turbulent changes to the labor market we've seen in recent years with the pandemic and the so-called Great Resignation. So more on this in the second session. Once again, a warm welcome to this Future seminar, and we'll be back shortly with Jonathan Malesic. A lot of us can relate to the notion of burnout, the feeling we get when you can't continue your work, you feel stressed or overwhelmed. If you haven't felt burnout yourself, you will have certainly witnessed it in others. But what causes burnout? Why does it appear to be a growing phenomena, and could we imagine a future without it? To help us answer these questions, we are joined now by Jonathan Malesic, one of the contributors to The New Age of Work. Hello, Jon, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Casper. It's wonderful to be here.
So you've had quite an interesting work life, I think it's safe to say. You've had employment as a sushi chef, as a parking lot attendant, and as a professor of theology. And at one point in your working life, you decided to quit your tenured job and start research on a book you published earlier this year titled The End of Burnout, Why Work Drains Us and How to Build Better Lives. What was it that set you on this path to try and understand burnout as a societal phenomena?
Right. As you mentioned, I was a theology professor for 11 years, and this had been my dream job. I had aspired to be a theology professor from about the age 20. And I got my dream, and we should perhaps be a little wary when we do get exactly what we want in life. Uh, and one of the questions that I was really interested in when I was teaching was the moral and spiritual issues that arise from our working lives. And this is, I published on this, I taught about this question. And then at some point, that question became not just academic for me, but existential. I began to wonder myself, what I was getting out of the work that I was doing. This had been my dream job, and yet I found it increasingly difficult just to get out of bed in the morning or to prepare for class. I found my temper growing shorter, and it was just more and more miserable. And after a couple years of trying to figure out what was happening to me, and after taking a semester of unpaid leave that didn't help at all, um, I decided to quit. And I was able to quit because my wife, who is also an academic, got a very good job offer here in Dallas, Texas, and so that was the occasion for me to leave this dream job. And it was in the weeks and months after that the concept of burnout kind of occurred to me as a possible explanation for what had happened. And so I started thinking about it. I started connecting it to those earlier moral and spiritual questions that I was interested in. And several years later now, the book is the outcome of all of that.
So you explain in the book how you believe a fundamental cause of burnout is, this idea that our work should be a site of purpose, a site of almost transcendent spiritual meaning. Can you explain what you mean by this?
Right. I think that work in wealthy countries like the United States, Denmark, and so on is it's more than just a means to a paycheck. We work not only to earn a living, but we work often to find dignity, to develop or to prove our character, and like you just said, to find purpose. So these are the promises that work makes to us in our societies. And work doesn't always live up to those promises. I mean, the promises are extremely high. And the reality is that work is often undignified. Work doesn't build our character, it often degrades our character. And we often wonder what that we find ourselves in jobs that for which the purpose is unclear. And so that disconnect or that gap between the ideals for work and the reality of our jobs is where burnout emerges. And so I think that the task of defeating burnout has to be closing that gap, both improving the conditions of work as well as getting our ideals closer to something more realistic.
Mm. And one of the things you touch on is how you believe one of the solutions to sort of burnout culture is to be found in things like workplace culture, community at work. These sort of, I guess you could call them softer values than if we look at things like paycheck, work hours, these sorts of things. Why do you believe these things, culture and community, hold at least part of the key to a future without or with less burnout than today?
Yeah, and I wouldn't want to entirely discount the importance of paychecks and schedules and things like that. But I think that we often overlook, like you say, the softer sides of work. And the reason to look to culture and community is that for a solution to burnout is because that's where the origin of burnout is. There's Burnout doesn't happen because something is wrong with you as a worker. Rather, it's because something has gone wrong in your workplace and in the broader culture of work. Those ideals that I mentioned are ones that we get from the culture. We don't make them up on our own. And so if our culture has unrealistic expectations of work, we're going to bring those to the workplace as well. And those are going to contribute to our burnout.
Right. I want to talk a little bit about the physical conditions for work. You've talked about the culture at work, as we discussed, the softer aspects. So the open plan office is the daily reality of workers, office workers, and knowledge workers worldwide today, and it's caught a lot of flack recently. There are studies published that point out that modern office layouts can in fact be very detrimental to not only office worker well-being but also to productivity. Do you see sort of the physical conditions of work, the spatial conditions of work, as being equally important in contributing to burnout as these other aspects you mentioned?
Yeah, quite possibly. And the dream of the open plan office was that it would enable collaboration. It literally breaks down the walls between different departments, different supervisors, different employees, so that everyone can contribute to everyone else's project. Well, the problem with that is that everyone does contribute. It becomes very easy to be interrupted. If someone is talking 2 desks away, that can be distracting. People can stop by your desk and give you more tasks. Frankly, I mean, collaboration it is intended to boost creativity and productivity, but it can often just mean increasing a workload because it's so easy just to ask someone to do one extra task. And so yeah, I think that the physical space of work matters. And our the solution, of course, that many offices are attempting right now is the fully remote workspace, where we're working from home, and that has its positives and negatives too. And the big drawback, of course, to working from home is that there's no longer any boundary between your work life and the rest of your life. And so while perhaps it's a little easier to avoid being assigned, more and more and more tasks, suddenly you no longer have any space between your work life and your home life. Physically, you literally have no space between them, and so the work life can end up taking over the rest of your life, because again, it's just so easy to drop by your desk and do one more task at any hour of the day.
So we've talked about some of the problems. What I find interesting about your work is that you diagnose the issues, but you also try to come up with some solutions to it. And you point to some interesting examples, I would even say role models, in your search for people and communities who practice sort of a more balanced approach to work and life, including monks and artists and hobbyists and others. What do you see in these groups of people that you believe we could all learn something from?
Yeah, if the problem, as I contend, is in our culture, then we need to look outside of the mainstream of our working culture to find the solution. And that could mean looking outside of the mainstream of technological economy. And so, yeah, one of the first places that I looked for an answer, for an alternative, I should say, to the culture of burnout was a Benedictine monastery in the desert of New Mexico in the southwestern United States. Even just to get to this monastery poses a challenge. It is, you go off of the highway and onto a dirt road for 13 miles into this beautiful canyon where the monks live almost totally off the grid, and they have to work to sustain themselves just like all of us do. But the main thing for the monks, the main point of their life, is communal prayer. So they gather together several times a day to recite, in Gregorian chant, which is familiar to many of us, the Psalms, and they do this for 5 or 6 hours a day. That is absolutely non-negotiable in their lives, and so they have to fit work in around that schedule, and they work generally 3 or 4 hours a day, 6 days a week. And when the chapel bell rings, calling them back to chapel, they have to drop their work and get to the more important thing. And when I asked one monk, what happens when your work feels undone at the end of that period, he said, you get over it. And it struck me that getting over it is an important spiritual discipline for those of us who live in burnout culture.
That's fascinating, and I wanna end on sort of a broad question. I want to ask you, Jonathan, what is your vision for the future of work? What things do you think we need to change today in order to make a better future at the workplace for the many?
Yeah, I think that basically, I hope that the future of work means somewhat less work for most people who are working today. I would like to see shorter schedules. If not 4-day work weeks, then at least 5-day work weeks with shorter hours. Again, we can look to these Benedictine monks who are only working 3 or 4 hours a day and manage to sustain themselves. Granted, they're partly relying on donations, but not entirely. And so I think that less work is one thing, and to make that possible, we need we need changes in several areas. So one is technological change. We should, I think, harness automation to get us out of tasks that are tedious and dangerous, and that we don't need to necessarily be doing, that human beings don't need to be doing. If we can automate it, great. The second is that will require economic change, and that is very clear in the United States, where so much of your ability to even to have even to count, even to have a say in society depends on paid employment. It will take political change and economic change to make it possible for people to live flourishing, decent lives with less work. That could mean, universal basic income, greater access to paid family leave, which we do not have in the United States, and similar kind of proposals that have been much discussed. But the third and honestly the most difficult one may be cultural change, changing the way we think about work's role in the good life. Cultural change, sometimes it happens very quickly, but more often it happens very slowly. It took centuries to develop the work ethic that we now have and that we now in some ways suffer from. And it will take certainly at least decades, and perhaps longer than that, to build the intellectual and cultural apparatus that we will need. And so I think that what steps we can take now to build a different future is to start thinking differently about work, to understand its role in our lives and imagine alternatives to it.
That's quite a few things on the list, I think it's safe to say. Are you optimistic that we can get this started and make it happen?
I am, yeah. I think that it's clear that so many people are dissatisfied with the position of work in our lives, and if we can harness that dissatisfaction, then the possibilities are limitless. So I think I have to be optimistic that real change can occur.
So let's end on a positive note. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for joining us today and sharing your work and your insights with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
And to you, all you watching out there, we'll be back shortly with Tamira Snell to talk about the shifting nature and purpose of work. Welcome back. We're now joined by Tamira Snell, who is a futurist and a senior advisor at the Copenhagen Institute for Future Studies. And I should mention before we begin our session here, if you have any questions out there for Tamira, feel free to drop them in the chat window, and we'll follow up towards the end with a short Q&A session. So Tamira, you work at the Institute with, I guess, broadly speaking, studying the behavioral trends of today to try to make sense of how we might live, think, and work in the future. And we just heard Jon explain how he believes some of the necessary changes to produce better workplaces in the future will need to happen on the cultural level, so at the workplace, among the people working there. We know from studies that younger generations tend to bring more of their personal values and morals into the workplace. There was a study published a few years ago that showed that millennials are overwhelmingly more likely to take a pay cut if it means working at a workplace that aligns with their personal values than baby boomers are. The difference was quite stark, showing that there are differences between how generations approach work and work life in general. So my question to you is, what changes do you see on the horizon as a result of new generations coming into the workplace?
Thank you, Casper. And this is also, I think, an extremely relevant perspective to apply to the future of work and future workplaces, to have this generational perception in mind, at least. However, when we start to using this terminology of generations, we also just need to have a slight degree of skepticism, of course, because when we're talking about generations today, we're talking about a lifespan or a time period of 15 years. And we've done so for the last 40 years. Before that, our generation was 25 years. And going forward, experts and researchers are even discussing whether we can apply the concept of generations, because things are happening so fast, and the context in which a generation grow up in is also something that is forming the general attitudes and values and needs of a generation. But if the context is too fragmented, of course this is something where it will become even harder to do this type of generalization as we do when we use generations. That being said, I think it's very interesting to see these differences when it comes to generations. You talked about baby boomers, also Generation X, Y, and Z, which are the more solid generations that we tend to refer to, and then millennials, of course. But if you look at the differences between Generation X and Z, for instance, Generation X grew up between 1965 and 1979, more or less. There's always a little bit of arguments around that. But they were actually the first generation to grow up with both parents working. So away from home. So the first generation to grow up with being in institutions most of their childhood, youth, etc. And you can see other cultural contexts or socioeconomic contexts that actually made an impact on this generation in terms of also the workplace, where when you try to define Generation X, it's typically in terms of being very minded on or focused on success and accumulating wealth, and also being very individualized. So very, very focused on personal success and how that could be established through their job or career. And also, like you mentioned, with baby boomers, this generation, we've also seen a tendency, a little bit less, but still being motivated by an increase in income or salary. And then what we see with Generation Z is again being brought up in a completely different context. The families that Generation Z are growing up in are very diverse. So we've seen the fragmentation or the diversification of the family of four. So the standard or general norms and values, of course, again then diversified. So there is a shift, and there are many different. You can take many different events that have been, of course, forming the Generation Z. One of the primary differences from Generation X is they've been called the Facebook generation, the network generation, also digital natives. So they are growing up or have been children in a time where the boundary between online and offline worlds have become more and more blurry, been merged more and more, and this we see on different levels have an impact on again then the values that they have, how they focus on diversity, equality, something that is also being stressed over the latter years, not just for this generation, but something pushing a cultural shift in general, but Me Too movement, etc., etc.
So you mentioned diversity, equality, these keywords. Could you give us a sense of some of the other sort of wishes and demands that these generations, we're speaking about Z and Y, I suppose, are bringing in to the workplace?
Well, we could say that they are more value-driven in their decisions about when they want to commit to a workplace or a new job. So they're looking at a workplace that also has similar values when it comes to ethics and morals, expecting that this workplace will take a stand as well. We also see that they actually have an expectation that work organizations see them as a whole person, so have a more holistic perspective on health and well-being, but also understanding that this siloed sphere of work belongs to the past. So they're quite demanding to being acknowledged for who they are, not just in terms of the job that they perform. So also the different skills, and also being able to actually keep on learning. They have an expectation of or wanting a value that is about, keep on being upskilled. Lifelong learning we've talked about. So having these types of expectations, of course, put another layer in terms of actually choosing or making a decision about where to work or accept a job offer, and also actually is related to what can also make these younger generations quit their jobs. We've seen studies showing that number one reason for actually thinking about quitting is a toxic work culture, and when and informing this definition is not being able to cater for diversity, equality, inclusion, respect. So all these elements that are actually really a part of the values of the younger generations.
And speaking of quitting, over the last few years, we've seen unusually high resignation rates across the Western world. Basically, more people are quitting their jobs now than at any time in the last 20 years. And this phenomena has been given many names, including the Great Resignation, the Big Quit, and probably lots of other names as well. It has even led some to suggest that what we're seeing now is sort of a broad-scale value shift, that more and more people are deciding that work should not be such a dominant part of my life, so I quit. That's the suggestion, at least. But what is your perspective on this?
I think that this is an extremely interesting tendency to follow and try to, pick apart and explore and understand. In my view, it is something that is pushed forward or driven by different factors, and something that is also not occurring in all parts of the world, just to stress that. So what we see, if we talk about the Great Resignation or the Big Quit, is that it is typically happening in North Europe and the US at the moment. So of course we can see how that will develop, and that of course it is also driven by a low unemployment rate. So this is one of the factors that are relevant here, because I would assume that then it will make it not as risky to actually make the decision and say, okay, I quit. I want to do something else. I'm not happy. I feel burned out, like we heard Jonathan talk about. So that is one of the reasons why we could see a tendency that people actually choose to do so. Another driving factor is, of course, the past few years of the pandemic, where we've seen a massive change in our work cultures and our norms about what it means to work, to have a 37 or 40-hour work week or whatever. When we talk about the Great Resignations and we start looking at, okay, so who are actually quitting, we see that primarily it's North Europe and the US, like I said, but it's newly educated, so new to the labor market. It is lower wage groups. However, we're starting also to see a group of 30 to 45-year-olds, and we are also slightly older, and we're also seeing actually not just blue-collar workers, if you could, be very generalized in that way. We're also seeing groups of management consultants, for instance, who are also choosing to resign and quit their jobs. So it's actually also moving into different spheres. And when we look then at different sectors and industries, we see that it is until now, again, because we don't know how this will develop, but we've seen a lot of resignations within retail industry, food services, accommodation. But this could again, change into other spheres. So there is definitely something that is worth noting, and something that is occurring right now that is very, very interesting. Calling it the Great Resignation, I don't know. It seems like these people are not quitting for good. So, dropping off the map completely. It seems like they are either taking a break or, switching industries or career paths. So some are talking about, okay, we should call it the Great Reshuffle instead. So reshuffling our work lives, or even the Great Expectations, because we're starting to also have new or revised priorities and expectations to what should our work lives be or become in the future.
Right, so we shouldn't expect hordes of white-collar workers to quit their jobs and open yoga studios in the coming years?
Maybe as a break, to reflect upon where they want to go or where they want to be. But no, I think it will be a matter of reshuffling rather than resigning. However, we also need to be aware of, for instance, an aging population. whereby the total workforce, of course, is declining. So other factors that will, other megatrends, societal currents that will kind of push the future of work. But I think one thing that is really interesting also to mention is, because we tend to talk about the Great Resignation as, this search for purpose or being disengaged. This is actually something that we started to see a bit before the pandemic already. So just saying that it's because of the pandemic, or because of us trying to find purpose in our changed work lives, that have become much more hybrid, etc., etc. We need to be careful with that, because we've seen that tendency already before.
So we've talked about generational differences. We've talked about the pandemic, the Great Resignation, or the Great Reshuffle. What, in your view, is the most? You can only choose one thing. What is the most important long-term change you see at the workplace, stemming from all the turbulence we're seeing today?
Only one thing.
Maybe two.
If I should try to kind of describe one umbrella term, that would be
you can do that.
yeah. So one general shift towards the future workplace would be from the homogeneous workplace towards the more heterogeneous workplace, and in manifold. So in different ways, not just in terms of hybrid work lives, being heterogeneous in online and offline ways of working, but also in the sense that we will see cross-generational workplaces where we have to open up for the diversity, the different needs and attitudes that different generations will still have, and also the diversity in general. So, and also for the younger generations being brought up within very different contexts or family constellations. If I can say one...
Go for it.
One more thing, I think it will also be interesting to actually think about when we talk about this, the future of work and the future workplace. This is, of course, something that is intertwined or interconnected with our everyday lives. So again, we cannot see work as isolated from the rest of our lives, because, like Jonathan also said, we can be we can be at work at any given moment at time, also due to digitalization, etc. However, this behavior or this norm of hybrid work is still not something that is mainstream when it comes to our ways of education. This is still not 100% hybrid, or not expected to be. Education contexts or schools or institutions are still very much in the physical world as one of the primary spaces for community and sense of belonging and building our self-narrative. So in that overlapping, or the gap between us or younger new generations to come, moving from educational spheres and into work places or work spheres, we also have to be aware of what the different norms and values associated here.
Thanks so much, Tamira. Those were my questions. I think it's time to move on to some of the audience questions. I have the first one lined up here. It's from Christine, who asks, what do you see as the greatest challenge facing workplaces after the pandemic?
That is a very good question. I would say that it will, if we take from the employer side of view, from the workplace organization, it will actually be to be able to accommodate for this new flexibility, but also understanding the very different needs there could be for people returning from a work life that has been primarily online and then going back to at least a hybrid setting. So being able to kind of be flexible towards the different employees and what they might need.
This question is perhaps a bit related, but it comes from Thomas, who asks, what do you see as the most important factors in a workplace to attract skilled workers and to keep them motivated in the future? You know, perhaps in the decades to come, it won't be cake on Fridays or Thursday bar or whatever. There might be some other things at play. How do you see this?
Yeah, and that again, a really good question, and not just something where we can only look towards the younger generations, because it will be cross-generational, right? At least having these reflections and also strategies into how can we create a sense of belonging. Because if you are always on online, or you don't have any physical meetings or social gatherings, it will be kind of like a long distance relationship. So you will not really have the loyalty or the sentiment to feel as engaged, maybe, or feel that you belong and that this is part of your self-narrative again.
Another question from Ömya. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Ömya. You ask, you talked about what expectations and desires younger generations have. What would be some things that we as young employees should know about what employers want / need from us so that we can succeed? So I guess Ömya is a young employee, him or herself, and want to know, what should I do to get hired?
Yeah. I think actually trying to... now we've talked a lot about using generations as kind of like a starting point to have this kind of discussion and reflection. So if we extend that thought and then again think about the cross-generational workplace. So from an employee or young employee point of view, it could also be to have that reflection the other way around, or going back to us, okay, who are hiring me? What kind of generation might they belong to, or what kind of values might be driving them? What is the elements that are present at the work culture here that can change, of course, and as a young employee, you might be a pushing factor or driving factor for actually being able to change also some aspects of the work culture, but still understand that you have to fit into some kind of context, and what are the values and norms here, and how might they be similar or different?
Here's a question that's interesting, I think, from Balaji. Again, apologies if I'm butchering your pronunciation, but you ask, have you found any connections between work from home to employees' cognitive performance across different parts of the work? What are the key drivers or barriers? So I suppose, does work from home create any kind of problems in terms of productivity or cognitive abilities, or have you come across any findings in your work relating to this?
Again, really, really good questions. What I have come across is, again, this, and something that also Jonathan referred a little bit to, that when all the boundaries between work and our everyday lives are becoming, completely blurred or merging together, it can also be difficult to actually, finding the time not to be productive or to really focus and solve an assignment because there's some laundry or there is some groceries that you could order online, or you could also clean a little bit because otherwise you don't have mental space. So of course we see that there are hybrid work lives are also posing challenges. It's not like this is the quick fix for the ways of working that we've known until now. But we've also seen that that people have become extremely productive and going from one meeting to the other without having any breaks. And then again, that can lead to other challenges, right, of, for example, burnout.
Definitely. With that, I think it's time to wrap up. Thanks to you, Tamira.
A pleasure.
Thank you for Jonathan for joining us. And thanks to all of you watching from home or from your offices or wherever you are. If you thought the discussions we had today were interesting, we hope you'll consider pre-ordering Entering the New Age of Work from our website, our web shop. We'll have a QR code for you on the finishing slide here. You can also find Entering the New Age of Work across newsstands in North America and Europe and Australia and New Zealand starting from May 16. Finally, I should mention that you can sign up to our upcoming future seminar on working in the metaverse. That's on May 24th, and like this one, it will be free and open to attend. But you need to sign up to attend it, so go on our website via the QR code and do that. Again, thank you all for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed the seminar, and I hope to see you next time.